Welcome to the Salt of the Earth podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Cobb. This is my co-host,
Thomas Pope.
and today we're here to talk about stuff.
This is our 7th podcast.
It's our 7th podcast. As you may notice in my camera, this is our first podcast recorded during the day, so we have sunlight behind us for the first time ever.
Daylight doesn't exist.
Because we usually record at night.
Fun fact.
So
what are we talking about today?
we're talking about mentoring / mentors, and biblical examples of them. We're also talking about hell and God's judgment and some common misconceptions about that.
Two topics that go very well together. They're basically the same topic.
Yeah, this is the first time our topics actually don't go well together. So they're a little bit unrelated, but with the hell, God's judgment topic, I was also from the book A Case for Faith by Lee Strobel, which we've talked about a chapter of that in our first podcast. But there was a chapter that stood out to me where the guy that Lee is interviewing he's like an expert on this apparently. And in this book, Lee is exploring a bunch of different topics. This is like his 6th topic. Or they're kind of all like common secular arguments against the loving nature of God. But anyway, I'll just read part of the chapter then. So Lee Strobel is interviewing this guy. Let's see if I find his name. Oh, it's Dr. Moreland. And I'll start a little bit way into it. Okay then, as I settle deeper into the couch, here's your chance to set the record straight. Let's lay some groundwork for getting our definitions in order. You say hell is not a torture chamber. Then what is it? The essence of hell is rational, he replied. Christianity says that people are the most valuable things in the entire creation. If people matter, then personal relationships matter, and hell is largely rational. In the Bible, hell is a separation or banishment from the most beautiful thing in the world, God himself. It is an exclusion from anything that matters, from all value, not only from God, but also from those who come to know him and love him. I was confused about something. Is hell a punishment for having broken God's standards? Or is it a natural consequence of people living a life where they say, I don't care if I'm separate from God, I want to do things my way. And then they are given their desire for all eternity by being separated from God forever? It's both, he said. Make no mistake, hell is punishment. But it's not a punishing, it's not torture. The punishment of hell is separation from God, bringing shame, anguish, and regret. And because we have both body and soul in a resurrected state, the misery experience can be both mental and physical. But the pain that's suffered will be due to the sorrow from the final, ultimate, unending banishment from God, his kingdom, and the good life for which we are created in the first place. People in hell will deeply grieve all they've lost.
All right, so that's pretty interesting. So this is something you've read. I haven't, so this is my first time hearing it.
Yeah. And I'll just preface this by saying there's a lot of arguments this guy brings that I haven't researched, and some of them I question a little bit. So, it's not like, obviously this is this guy's opinion, but I think I agree with most of what he says.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so he makes the case that hell is not necessarily it's not what we think of it as a lot as like a torture chamber or as this burning lake.
Yeah.
It's it is essentially torture and punishment, but that comes from being absolutely separated from God and from all meaning.
Yeah.
The case he's making.
Here's just the example, because like Earth would be hell for the fact that weren't for the Holy Spirit, for God's presence, and for Christians.
Mm-hmm.
because the only good things come from God, and in the absence of good, it would be purely evil, and it would descend into chaos even more than it already has.
Well, if we didn't all have God's basic moral standards imprinted on our hearts from birth, then we'd have no reason to, or very little reason to work together in a society.
Yeah,
It'd be every man for themselves. Gonna get the best I can while I live.
we'd be animals basically.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah, and we would not, and as you could probably imagine, that would basically turn into hell itself because,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and some people would say that Earth people do throughout history people have acted like animals already, but it'd be even more so.
Or evolutionists get into the idea that we are no better than animals. We just happen to be smarter than them. And then some make the case that maybe we aren't even smarter than them. But so anyway, so this view on hell, you mentioned, he makes some arguments that you don't necessarily know 100%. And I think this is kind of maybe the case for this one too, where if you look in the Bible, any description of heaven or hell, it's kind of hard to say like, oh, this is exactly what it will be like, because it's hard to tell whether it's speaking literally or figuratively.
Yeah.
So the Bible describes hell as a lot of different things: the place of weeping and gnashing of teeth, as a fiery lake, as it compared it to Gehenna, which was like the burning trash dump outside Jerusalem, basically.
This guy makes the argument that a lot of the descriptions are figurative, especially like burning like a fire is a figurative. He makes that argument because how can you have both darkness and fire? But in the end, what it comes down to is merely the fact that it's going to be separation from anything that's good.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing good can be in hell because, and so therefore it'll be purely evil.
Mm-hmm.
And in purely evil, it would be like torture, I guess.
Yeah. So in that respect, so there's a lot of things in the Bible we can't necessarily say it's figurative or it's literal. So essentially the kind of perspective he brings is just kind of another way of looking at hell. Like, he's looked at, the Bible, and he's come up with this kind of model, which I think is a helpful one to think of. We're separated from God. We're separated from meaning. We're separated from all that is good, and that's pretty terrible, even without any fire,
Mm-hmm.
We could just be in a blank gray room, and that would be pretty torturous, right?
Yeah. And so I think the takeaway from this is that hell is not like, it's totally our own choice.
Mm-hmm.
If we reject God, then God, it's not God's fault if we reject him. And rejecting God is what gets us in hell, because if we reject God, we can't go to heaven, obviously.
Right. I like the idea that was posed in that the bit you read about how perhaps hell, being this place of ultimate separation of God, is like the answer to everyone wanting to live their lives rejecting and separating from God, saying, I don't need God.
Mm-hmm.
I can go on without. And so God's like, okay, you're right. You don't need me. Here, go to a place without me. So I like that. I mean, that's kind of an interesting idea, because it
puts it on us.
Yeah, it's like, okay, throughout the Bible, there's several things where it's kind of like, by your own actions condemn you, or something along those lines,
Mm-hmm.
where, if we live our lives saying that we don't need God and saying that we can be separate from God, then God doesn't actually have to open his book of law and say, like, here's what you did wrong. He can just look at you and be like, well, you did this. Okay. So we can be condemned by ourselves, and in theory, he wouldn't even have to start going into the lists of commandments that we haven't, we've disobeyed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
I mean, there are some people that will have claimed God but still go to hell. That's biblical. But I think for a large part, people either consciously or subconsciously have denied God in their own life.
mm-hmm.
Maybe even pretending to be Christians. And they either like as a conscious decision or just a like subconscious decision. They've denied God and they said,
Mm-hmm.
I don't want you in this part of my life. And as we know, you can't petition God.
Mm-hmm. Claiming God is like the first 5% of the battle, or 1%, something like.
Yeah.
And a lot of people do that, and they live a very. They claim to be Christians, but they might describe themselves as like church-going Christians or something like that. But in reality, the way they live their life shows that they are actively in defiance of what God says, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Well, like I think of like in Revelation, the Church of Laodicea, neither hot nor cold. They're just lukewarm. They think they're really great, but they're actually just kind of meh, and God doesn't want meh.
Mm-hmm. And so if we flip that, the essence of living or going to heaven is saying we need God. That's what it comes down to.
Saying it and then living
like we need God. Because we do. And so that's what it comes down to as far as living a Christian life.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
The bare essence of it is knowing that you need God, and then because of that knowledge, because of that belief, if you really believe it, you will act accordingly, and you will want to do the things that he has commanded of us.
And it starts at baptism. Baptism is a sign that we are dead to our old selves and we are resurrected in God because we need him. Mm-hmm. And then that's just the start, though. Mm-hmm. We can't change our minds. We have to stay with it, and we have to live like it and control our own bodies and minds according to that. So I like it because it just it simplifies it, and it kind of he kind of makes it simple and easy to understand.
Right. And I guess while we're on the subject of like hell and eternity, it's kind of like a prevalent view that people like ask like or wonder like, oh, I just don't see how God could possibly like banish people to hell for all eternity. Like would a good God really do that? Would a good God really banish innocent people to hell? Well, the answer to that is no. He won't banish innocent people to hell. Mm-hmm. But nobody is innocent, right?
Yeah.
So I was reading a book recently, rather listening to it, Counterculture, by David Platt, and he was posing the idea that the most like counterculture, like I'm trying to think of the word, controversial view in the Bible is not some of the views that people typically point to, but the most controversial thing in the Bible is that God is not going to banish some of us, essentially. And he made the argument that a just God, if you think of like a just judge, their job is to punish those who have done wrong. Just judges, if you've committed a crime, they're going to punish you for it, right?
Yeah.
If they don't do that, we would call them a terribly unjust judge, and we would want them out of there. If they let terrible criminals through, we would want them out of there, right? So a just God would punish all crime, right? And if you really think about it, mercy is not justice.
Mercy is not giving people what they deserve.
No, it's so when God gives us this opportunity to be saved and to not go to hell, that's actually more amazing than if he just, oh, you made it, we're going to hell.
Because on our own, we'd all end up in hell because we all have denied God at one point in our life.
So you think of like all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God.
Yeah.
All have rejected God. We all deserve to be punished in order to be brought to justice. That's justice. Is we've committed crimes, therefore we are punished. But God has given us grace, and grace actually makes life unfair. Because fairness would be us to come to justice, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of the wonderful thing. The thing that makes it so spectacular is that he sent his son, and through that gave us an opportunity to kind of
not be dealt justice.
Not be dealt justice, yeah. Which it's an interesting thought, because most people, like, they ask the question, like one reason why they might not accept Christianity is because they can just not accept the idea that God banishes people to hell for all eternity. And it is a hard idea to deal with, but
it's not logical.
Altogether, no. It's like if like in like thinking like of a courtroom, right? If a judge was asked to convict like, I don't know, a murderer or a rapist or something like that, we would want that person to go to jail for that.
Yeah.
If they did that, we would, no question, like, if we would want the judge to say, you're guilty, you're going to jail. If the judge said, no, you're going free, which I know judges can't always just do that, but let's assume the judge just said, no, you can go free, even though you committed this, we'd be outraged. We would, and that's the same position we're in, really. Just more thoughts tacked onto that. So like I said, I haven't actually read the book that you've read, but besides hearing the short part you just read. But
and the question you posed, like, some people will say that, how can a loving God send some people to hell? That's what this guy asked him. That's where this response came from. Because he is a loving God, but he's also a perfect God, and perfection cannot be united with imperfection. And that's why he gave us grace. But if we do not take him up on the offer, then that's our own fault.
Yep. You can really blame no one but yourself, right?
Yeah, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink.
We've all been led to water.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't need to do.
So, interesting thoughts.
So, our main topic for this week's podcast is mentoring / mentors. And I guess just to preface this, I think we've both had different experiences with this, right? Because
yes,
I've had a mentor since I was, he started off as a teacher, and then he's kind of morphed into being my spiritual mentor. Over, like, I would say, I started considering him my mentor like a couple years ago. And
my background on that is a lot different, because I would not really say I've ever had a mentor, really. Maybe, like, at times, some close, like, friends groups or study groups, but never like that same kind of experience of a one-on-one mentor. So we come into this with different perspectives.
And I guess I'll start by saying that I honestly has changed my life, because I could definitely see myself not in the church at all if that wasn't for that.
So I guess first, just go ahead and talk about more of your experience with having a mentor and why you think it's so important.
Well, especially like teenage guys. They have a need for accountability and also somebody to challenge them. Because I know over my 13 to like 15-year-old years, I tended to be very, you can get to be very lazy and unmotivated, and
Mm-hmm.
and you don't really see any purpose to life, and
Typical teenager things.
yeah, teenager things, and so he kind of, well, he was teaching me throughout that, and yeah, and then over different hardships I've had, he's helped me and he's talked to me about it, but most of all he's challenged me to grow, and most of the spiritual activities that I do are stuff that he's challenged me to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would not be to the point I was now, because, yeah.
So you mentioned like if you hadn't had it, you might like conceivably you wouldn't be part of the church even now, So
Yeah, conceivably.
So why would you think that? So what exactly did it add to you that you think that without having you would have fallen away?
Well, I would probably not have taken my faith seriously at all, and that could have led to me falling away.
Okay.
Because nobody would have been besides a Bible class, which you don't really get a lot of you don't get much accountability from a Bible class.
Right.
I mean, aside from that, I wouldn't have had anybody. I mean, nobody would have been really pushing me or challenging me or making me think deeper about my faith and actually taking it seriously. And I think it's important. If people don't take their faith seriously, it's hard for them to hold on to it when they hit a rough patch.
And for you kind of had the I don't know how unique it is, but unique situation of your dad not being part of the church growing up. So you didn't have a spiritual father figure in your life,
yeah,
to kind of fill in some of those roles from the get-go.
Mm-hmm. Which is why this is so important.
Mm-hmm.
But you fortunately had.
So yeah, I did grow up with a believing father, preacher from time to time. So I did have that to some degree, and he, so I did have kind of an example of what a Christian father figure was like, So I had something to aspire to some degree, but at the same time, well, my dad did not take part in the same kind of direct challenging or one-on-one kind of stuff, because just generally my family's bad at communication, and we just never got into those kind of deep conversations with each other. So at one point I did have a believing dad, but also I didn't have some of the things that you had in having more of a mentor figure.
Yeah. And so I guess, yeah, we both have different experiences with it, and from my experience, it's been incredibly valuable. Thomas turned out okay.
Oh, I guess could have been better.
Could have been better. I mean, but.
And so I guess one thing for me is I've kind of known for a while that it would be really good to have a mentor, but at the same time, there's not a lot of people I would point to and be like, oh yeah, they would be a mentor. Or there's not a lot of people who are going out and seeking people to mentor, which I found as a significant problem, because it's well, what if I want to mentor, but then there's no one there? Do I have to? I guess I have to approach someone and then try to get them to want to do it, right?
Well, yeah, and which is incredibly difficult, especially if there's no precedent for that.
I mean, you were fortunate enough to have someone essentially approach you and want to do it, right?
Yeah, even though he didn't tell us that at the get-go, that was his goal, because he knew that he knew that our dad was not in our lives spiritually, and that was his first he saw a need and he wanted to fill it. And so if he had, obviously I wouldn't have reached out to him if he hadn't first reached out to me. So,
I think that's probably the case for a lot of people when you're like a, young teen or something like that. Like, you're not going to have it on your mind to reach out to someone like that.
yeah, unless somebody else has a mentor. But like, so it's very unlikely for someone to, for it to go like the young person finds a mentor. It's almost always the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess the main takeaway for me is I should start looking for people, especially as I get a little older,
Mm-hmm.
to reciprocate the gift I've been given onto others. I personally don't feel old enough yet, but I don't know.
It's kind of a.
I don't.
It's not an easy. There's not like a line where, but it's kind of something where you have to feel that you're capable of doing it almost.
Yeah, but I'll get there, and
so that's like something I've been thinking about is like, well, okay, I did not grow up with a mentor. I still do not have really a mentor, but I have that desire for one. So maybe I should be the mentor that I wish I had to someone else.
Yeah.
So have that idea. And so there have been several times when I've thought about it. I haven't really ever committed to it just because, I don't know. It's a jump to make, but
I try to keep my eyes open, and in my church personally, I haven't really seen a need with anybody in particular. And like I said, I don't feel qualified at this point, but hopefully, I'll try to keep my eyes open to it over the next, and just kind of look for an opportunity. So,
mm-hmm. So I guess we should spend some time maybe looking at what the Bible has to say on mentoring, or on the idea of mentoring, essentially. I don't think the Bible actually ever uses the word mentor, unless certain versions translate it that way. But there is the idea of it throughout the Bible, essentially.
mm-hmm.
So, thinking of some biblical examples, just some of the ones that were off the top of my head was like Barnabas and Paul. When Saul became Paul and stopped killing Christians and started trying to, started being one, he kind of went through a period. Well, first off, he just kind of went into isolation somewhere for a while. But then after he got back, Barnabas kind of took him in and was kind of, I guess you could say, mentoring him for a while. Kind of raising him in this new idea of Christianity rather than Judaism, which Paul had been a very zealous proponent of.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's an example of, someone took someone else in who had a need, and they were both grown men. We don't know what age they were exactly, but
yeah. So it doesn't always you don't always have to do somebody that's much younger than you. So could be somebody about your same age, but it has more to do with spiritual maturity, and I'm assuming Barnabas was spiritually mature at that point.
Spiritual maturity, and also just the ability to, or having the experience and the ability, like the experience that you can pour off on someone who could use it, So it could be spiritual maturity, but it could also be other forms of maturity, right? That someone else does not yet have either because they're younger or because they just haven't had the experiences that you've had, and then you pour them out on them. And going on for more biblical examples of mentoring, Paul and Timothy, and I think you could maybe make the case Paul and several other people.
Mm-hmm.
Timothy is, I think, maybe the more obvious one.
Yeah. And this was the case of like a mature Christian teaching a younger Christian
who's also fairly mature.
From
the way it sounds.
He's also fairly mature. So it's and Paul had experience. He wasn't active in the church, and Timothy also wanted to be active in the church, I would assume.
Well, I think he was essentially taking the role of he was an evangelist, essentially.
Yeah.
So,
And so Paul was also evangelist, so it kind of worked out because.
And so Paul started writing. So 1st and 2nd Timothy are letters that Paul wrote to Timothy, instructing him and encouraging him in several certain things, so encouraging him to, like appoint elders and to live a certain way and to not let people look down on him being young, essentially. So these letters are essentially long distance mentoring taking place, which I think is something I kind of like about reading through 1st and 2nd Timothy, is because it is perspective. It's from an older, more mature Christian to a younger Christian who is becoming an evangelist and things, and giving advice from that kind of perspective downwards. So it's really interesting, especially since it's just written to a younger Christian, which I relate to.
Yeah, same. And another thing we have to remember is I think mentoring is somewhat synonymous with discipling.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty much the same thing in my opinion. And so Jesus was like a mentor of sorts to his disciples.
Mm-hmm. And so that's the third example we have on here.
That's the third example. Yeah.
So you think about what he did with his disciples is he spent several years spending the majority of time with like these 12 guys, just pouring himself into them, trying to strengthen them and get them to a point where they could be okay on their own after he left, essentially. Mm-hmm. So he's pouring the majority of attention to these 12 people, and he's also giving these sermons with thousands of people in them, but then, he'll say a parable or something, and then he'll be turned aside and he'll give like the meaning of it just to like his close disciples, right?
Yeah.
So he's essentially, he's mentoring, he's discipling. It means pretty much the same thing. He's strengthening them up so that they can then be okay on their own to go and do the same to others.
Yeah. So, yeah, because Jesus did not focus all his energy in just giving like general group sermons, though he did do that a little bit. His main focus was on these 12 people. And so it seems like the pattern Jesus was setting is it's more important to you train these people and these people train these people and do more of like a network than the more stereotypical
have a figurehead.
One preacher preaches to 10,000 people,
or however many people are in a church.
Though both methods are good ways.
They have their place.
We tend to lean more on one than the other in today's church.
So so we think about some of the things Jesus did. So not only was he teaching them, but there were a couple instances at least where he told his disciples he sent them out in groups of 2 to go ahead of him, and he gave them power to heal and to cast out demons. And so he was sending them ahead of them kind of as like a trial run of them being on their own, a trial run of them being out there and teaching and doing the same kind of discipling and even being able to heal people on their own. And then there's the one time I think he sent the 12 out, and there's another time he sent 70 out. So he's kind of, not only is he strengthening them, but he's also challenging them and kind of pushing them out on their own, kind of like a mother bird out of the nest or something.
But he was intentionally separating himself from them so that they had, a chance to do it without his help.
And I guess I see that as kind of, so that's like the biblical model for discipleship or for mentoring, is that the idea is not necessarily that it is something that goes on forever and ever, right? It's not like you're going to be mentored by one person for your whole life. I almost see the idea as almost kind of being like they mentor you for a while, and then you go out and you mentor other people. And maybe you still have a mentor. Yeah. But
they kind of, their role doesn't have to be as big. It shrinks over time. How much they had to put into you. But yeah. Well, the mentor I have, he also has a mentor that challenged him to find mentees. And
mentees, that's a weird word.
And I think he gets a lot of value out of his mentor as well. and so yeah, I think the ultimate spot to be is in the middle. You have
Yeah.
someone below you and someone above you, or multiple you below you, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. Depending on how many you can handle.
Yeah, and depending on your calling, I guess. I think like some people, like evangelists, maybe like Paul, they're more focused on general groups
Mm-hmm.
and less on individual
Right.
mentees. But others may be more focused on mentoring, like 6 people maybe, and not so much on like big groups.
Right. So I knew a guy, a close friend, and he attended the same like college Christian group as me, and he actually he decided that he wanted. Well, he was part of the staff of the group actually. So he
He's a
ran
little
all,
more senior.
yeah. His job was actually not super into teaching. He ran all the like lights and PowerPoints and stuff and the sound system. But essentially, there came a point where he decided that he wanted to kind of bow out of that and focus a lot more on individual one-on-one relationships. And so he stopped doing that, and then he started. He mentored like 2 or 3 guys, I think, and he also would. I think he had someone who mentored him. So he started focusing on that, and he started focusing on small groups more instead of the way he was helping out before, where, like I said, he's running the tech booth, not necessarily a
Spiritually demanding
job. I guess a necessary one if you want to have those kind of things, but
it's a deacon job.
It's a deacon job, I guess. Yeah. So he actually stopped doing that in order to focus much more on this one-on-one or small group kind of interaction.
Mm-hmm.
And he challenged me a couple times to do it as well. I didn't do it because, I don't know, I procrastinate or something.
Well, you're doing it now, I guess.
So yeah, so there's this idea, and if we think about Jesus and his disciples a little more, what was like some of the very last instructions that Jesus left for them? Is the Great Commission, right?
Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And
making disciples of them is somewhere in there.
Yeah, making disciples of all nations, teaching them everything I've commanded you.
So here from the very beginning, when Jesus kind of adopts them as his disciples, he's teaching them and instructing them and strengthening them and challenging them. And then his last instruction is for them to go and do the same, essentially.
So in my opinion, the ultimate vision of a church, or of the church, is you have multiple forms of instructing. You have like big groups, like sermons, and you have like small groups, and you also have one-on-one. And some people are more gifted with big groups. Some people are more gifted with small groups, and some people are more gifted with one-on-one. And a lot of people do multiple of those.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think where we've kind of fall short in the modern church is one-on-one, and sometimes small groups. So small groups there's some churches that are very good with small groups.
Mm-hmm. Some focus on it a lot more than others, and some of them just like seemingly don't have any small groups at all.
Yeah. And so I think we need to work on that. And I think a lot of the problems with one-on-one mentoring is that you don't have, like, there's not like structure to it. It's not like there's, most churches are not going to work on that as much because it's more of an individual decision.
Mm-hmm.
And so individual Christians need to start looking for a need.
And I think like the church as a whole, like the leaders of it, the elders, the evangelists, should be encouraging people and giving them the kind of resources they need to get started in this, and challenging them. Mm-hmm. And whichever mentors are already there should be challenging their mentees to do this. But it ultimately comes down to the individuals to I'm messing up with the word. To continue doing it.
Yeah, and I think it starts with the elders, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Well, that in theory, the elders should be challenging and should be kind of pushing the issue
and mentoring
themselves. Some times that's not fully the case as much as maybe as much as I wish it would be.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the elders are not fulfilling that kind of teaching, mentoring role, and then that leaves everyone else to kind of, decide whether they want to do it or not on their own.
Yeah, in ultimate world, the elders will be mentoring people and then challenge them to mentor people, and creating a network that way from the top.
Mm-hmm. And this network goes beyond the bounds of the church as well, because we look at the biblical model. It also would involve going outside of the church and trying to make disciples out of unbelievers.
Mm-hmm.
And so you end up this being kind of not only an internally focused like growth program, but also an external focused gospel spreading program, which is the ultimate goal, right? I mean, if it's the last thing Jesus said to his disciples, it's pretty much, it's pretty important.
Because the best way to spread the gospel is one-on-one,
Mm-hmm.
or the most effective way. And I think one of the biggest hurdles in becoming a mentor or being a good mentor is being a mentor, you have to be very spiritual diligent yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can't be a mentor if you're slacking off yourself. It's the most demanding. Like with preaching a sermon, you could easily preach a sermon and lack yourself. But mentoring is all about the one-on-one. It has to go both ways.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just be telling and not without showing.
Right. And you also have to just have more frequent, interaction and communication. And really what it comes down to is you're pouring yourself into another person.
Mm-hmm.
And that takes time and energy and effort.
And so there's people in the church that may not feel qualified because they don't feel like they have reached the point where they need to be, which could be correct, or in some cases they may just be overthinking it. And obviously nobody's perfect, so you have to realize that too.
Well, so like and this is kind of something that is a bit of a failing of mine is what is the point that you can start reaching out and mentoring other people? Well, essentially it's the point that you are more mature spiritually than someone else around you.
Exactly.
And if you think of it that way, all of a sudden there is definitely someone that you could mentor.
Yeah, for sure.
Maybe not in the church, but not, like we said, non-believers. And so thinking of it that way, that's kind of an area where I failed, because I have had this idea, and also I have recognized people that I could mentor, and then I did nothing. So getting started is sometimes just a hard leap to make. Something I struggle with myself, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
So we have some verses we can go through. So along the ideas of you talking about elders as kind of being the start point of all this.
Initiate it.
So we have a passage here about that. So 1 Peter 5, 1-5. So I exhort the elders among you, as a fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ. So this is Peter writing, who calls himself an elder. So as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed, shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. So it says, shepherd the flock, right? Mm-hmm. Exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly. So you get this idea of you're overseeing and kind of pouring yourself into the flock to make sure that they have what they need, right?
Mm-hmm. It also says they are to be examples to the flock, which comes back to the point of a lot of mentoring is just personal growth.
Mm-hmm.
You can't be pushing other people if you're not pushing yourself.
And you cannot be honestly telling other people to do things if you are not doing them or trying to do them yourself.
Yeah.
Practice what you preach, I guess.
And again, like, mentoring is the place where that matters the most, because people will actually see it way more than a larger group. Anyway, go on.
So the rest of the passage says, and when the chief shepherd appears, Jesus, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. Likewise, it had some instructions for elders there. Now it has some instructions for the younger people. So likewise, you younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So on the flip side of that, the younger people are to subject themselves. They are to respect and to kind of recognize the place that those who are spiritual elders around them do have, or should have, more experience and maturity in things than them, and that is something to be respected.
They should want to be mentored.
They should want to be mentored, and they should realize that, it's really, it's something important. It's a blessing, really, that there is an elder around them who has that more experience to give them. And also that they have to be humble in doing it.
They humbly submit to their teachings.
So not like, you don't know what you're talking about, or I'm already good.
Yeah.
And so there's actually, I don't think we have it here. So there's several places in the Bible where it talks about elders, right? And some people might look at that and say, well, this is only really relevant to me if I am an elder, if I want to be an elder, right? But I see it kind of differently. I see it that things that are talking about elders, it's painting a kind of a picture of like the ideal, like spiritually mature Christian, right? And so any of us can look at that and say, I can gain benefit from this. If this is the ideal, like spiritually mature Christian, that's something for me to aim for, right?
Yeah. Even if you don't personally want to be a mentor, you do want to be spiritually mature. Or an elder, rather.
So I don't know where I was going with this. I turned to a passage about elders, but it actually has nothing to do with what we're talking about. Oh. So we're not actually talking about elders. We're talking about mentoring. But so you see, the idea of an elder is that they do that kind of shepherding and teaching.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's like, if that's the ideal, like, mature Christian, the thing you're aiming for, maybe we should also be teaching and pouring ourselves into others. Maybe a slightly different way than an elder would, but
yeah.
So another good example of this is in Titus 2:3-5, which the first chapter of Titus does talk about elders, but the second chapter is talking about instructions to different groups of people, so like older men, younger men, older women in this case. So Titus 2:3-5, do you want to read that?
Yeah. Older women, likewise, are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers or slaves to too much wine. They are to teach what is good, so train the young women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled, pure, working at home, kind, and submissive to their husbands, that the word of God may be reviled.
May not be reviled.
May not be reviled.
So see, here we have this picture of the older women, or those with more experience, should teach and train the younger women on how to do a variety of things. Not only, not necessarily just, teach them to be more spiritually strong. It lists a long list of things, and not all of them are really related necessarily to being a strong Christian, though I guess they are all in a way.
You're talking about it.
Oh, am I?
Yeah, it's okay.
So was that hurt at all?
It's hurt enough, yeah. It's fine.
Okay. So like, the older women are to train younger women to work at home, to be kind, to be self-controlled and pure. So some of those things are definitely like things related to being a strong Christian, but some of them are just pouring out, physical experience of life, like how to raise children, right?
Mm-hmm.
Things like that older women have a lot of experience on that the younger women can benefit from.
Yeah, and so it's kind of like if you're a mentor to somebody in the church, it's more than just the spiritual side. You can also be mentoring on the physical side, the everyday side, which we need as well as just practical on a practical level.
And ideally, the spiritual side and physical side also connect because
and so you should have your mentor on your physical side should also be a Christian, because they can intertwine and
going with what we were talked about last week, separation from the world, and in that verse in Corinthians, do not be yoked with an unbeliever. Like having a mentor who is not a believer makes no sense because they are pouring their experience and their perspective and their life advice into you. But nothing is purely on a practical level. Everything connects together at some point. So essentially they're pouring their life view into you, which if their life view does not involve Christianity, then it's eventually going to skew things. Yeah. And so a life view, even about things like raising children or other physical things like that, should at its heart be connected with our spiritual perspective. So yeah, even training on everyday things, it's you want to have, if somebody is intimately training you or mentoring you, even on the most basic of tasks, you still want them to be a Christian. You still don't want to be learning from somebody that's not a Christian, even if it's just about something simple like your job or something like that. So these passages specifically talking to older women. The couple verses above it talk about older men, and I think the couple verses under it talk about younger men. It doesn't specifically say that older men should train and teach the younger men like this, but I think we can maybe assume it. Does it make any sense that the older women would be teaching the younger women and passing on their experience, and then the older men would just be ignoring the younger men? Yeah. No, doesn't really make sense. So it applies. So these verses are specifically about older and younger women, but it applies to just people in general, just Christians in general. We should be pouring out our experience and knowledge to those younger than us. And there's the other idea. I was just going to say, connected to that, I think it's important to say this. I believe that your mentor should also be, for us, it should also be a guy, and vice versa. Yeah. That goes without saying, probably, but it doesn't make sense, right? I think it would. Because they're going to have the most relevant experience to what you are or what you will go through. Yeah. So I would never mentor a girl. Just it wouldn't make a ton of sense. It wouldn't make any sense. I mean, I could teach us. You could maybe give advice on certain things, I guess, but yeah. But or I guess the example is sometimes elders will provide marriage counseling, but that's a completely different scenario. Yeah. You're kind of, I guess, mentoring a couple, and you're mentoring them based on a specific topic like marriage and relationships, as opposed to just everything. Yeah. So another thing before we move on from this passage is it says, so it uses the word older, so older women teaching the younger women, and we see that sometimes, and I guess my natural assumption is older women, okay, so it's talking about someone who's in their 60s or 50s or 70s, something way up there, right? Yeah. But is it? In my opinion, it could just be, I think older could just mean you're older than the person you're mentoring by it doesn't say, but I'm assuming by a significant amount, at least probably 10 to 15 years. But so there you have. So what if it's talking just relatively and it's not any specific age at all? Yeah. So it's saying, okay, if you have a few more years, if you have a few more experiences, then you should be qualified. You should be qualified enough to at least give some benefit to someone younger than you.
Yeah.
There's a way to think about it. So, I mean, there's a decent number of people that I am older than in this church and around me. Same for you even. Maybe
Even
not
me.
maybe not by a margin of like 10 to 15 years, because then they start being really young and maybe too young to
Have any benefit,
to
but
properly mentor. But there's still potentials. If you want a really simple verse that describes this idea, it's Proverbs 27:17. Iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. And again, this does not actually mention mentorship or discipleship at all, but the idea is there that, if two people are challenging each other and working together, then the end result is that they will both be
benefited.
They will both be strengthened. They will both be sharpened. Pretty simple idea that kind of encapsulates the entire idea is that, okay.
This is about mutual benefit. Or benefit.
Yeah.
Mutual benefit.
So mutually beneficial agreement or circumstance, I guess.
Which, as I've already kind of implied, mentoring somebody is not only for them, it's also for you. Because it's one of the best ways to challenge yourself to keep growing. Because obviously you don't want them to catch up to you.
Well, so like you mentioned, and I felt the same feeling of not feeling ready or qualified to mentor. And sometimes the idea just comes into my mind, well, what if the best way to become qualified to mentor is to start mentoring? Like, what if the best way to be able to do it is to do it?
It's possible.
I don't know.
Probable.
So that leads me to the thought, like, okay, well, I should start mentoring someone, right? And then I'll maybe, who knows? Maybe I'll find out if I'm qualified or not. Or I will become qualified.
Yeah, you'll have to.
Or I'll go down in flames and bring them with me. So we have a few other short verses here. Do you want to choose one?
Yeah. Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes 4:10. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up.
Hold on. I'm pretty sure we should include whatever is slightly before that, because
You think it's relevant?
I think
You're a
it
big
is.
context guy, aren't you?
I kind of am. For if they fall, we don't even know who they is if we don't think of context.
Well, he's looking at basically how this applies to mentoring is everybody's going to go through times in their life where they're less strong and they make mistakes. And part of mentoring is building a relationship and building trust.
Mm-hmm.
And so people, even if maybe they're having trouble with God, maybe they'll still trust your mentor. And that's another valuable part of it is you can be someone that will help bring them back if they have trouble.
So the full passage is starting in verse 9. 2 are better than one because they have a good return for the labor. For if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. But woe to the one who falls when there is not another to lift him up. Furthermore, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? And if one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly torn apart. So I think that gives extra
So it's
insight.
pretty much similar to Proverbs verse. It just has to do with the fact that
If you're trying to do everything on your own, you will be more easily overpowered than if you are working with, if you are two. If you have someone strengthening you, and if you're strengthening them, then you'll both be more likely to stand. Mm-hmm. And then at the end, I also like that last verse, a cord of 3 strands is not quickly torn apart, which I think of a lot of times as like a good model for relationships, because you have a relationship, you have two people, but oftentimes people have a lot of disagreements and things. When you have that third component, which I think of as God, if you have two people, and God is part of that relationship, especially when it comes to like marriage or something like that, that is like the ideal, like strongest relationship, because if they have God as a, significant binding factor, then nothing is going to ever tear them apart, because God will keep them together. Whereas if they were just two people with a relationship, if they had a big enough disagreement or something, then they're gone, right?
Yeah.
So there's another way to look at it. 3 people mentoring is not probably as common, and that's not really what we're talking about, but it has to do with the same idea of relationships.
Yeah. So basically, Christianity is very much relational. Relational. Religion, I guess, because the way we share it is through relationships. That's the primary and most powerful way to share.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is a religion, or this is a faith about personal relationship with God. And so the best way for people to see that is by seeing you.
Mm-hmm.
And so throughout the Bible, you see how Jesus discipled his disciples in small group settings. They had an example to follow, and then they became an example for somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the modern era of the church, we can sometimes neglect that aspect of our faith, or of reaching out. We try to do it too often through sermons or larger group settings, and sometimes neglect the more intimate, smaller groups or one-on-one.
We forget kind of the central calling that we all have as Christians, which is making disciples, which cannot be done the same. If we look at the way Jesus did it, it's a very different way than sitting in church. That's not making disciples, that's teaching.
Yeah, that's...
And so this idea of mentoring and discipling is pretty core, and I think when I think about it, I think that everyone should get involved in either mentoring or being a mentee, and then eventually also mentoring. And I say that kind of not to be hypocritical. You know my background. I have not had a mentor, and I have also not mentored despite feeling the conviction to do it, right? So I'm not trying to say that and be like, oh man, he's not doing what he's saying. I struggle with it as well.
Yeah. And so that's the big takeaway, because the one-on-one relationships in the small groups is what holds the body of Christ together. If all we see of each other is in a big group, it's harder. It's harder to be connected to people.
Mm-hmm.
And we lack. Yeah, the one-on-one relationships is the strongest glue we have for a church. And so if something comes in that tries to tear us apart, the one-on-one relationships are our best way to stay together through a network of small groups and mentoring. And so I can't understate how important this concept is, of not just the mentoring concept, but like small groups concept. It's incredibly important.
That's something I started to realize after I like started going to college and things, where I actually first started getting exposed to much deeper, closer knit small groups, which I hadn't really had before. I started realizing like how important that was and how I had been missing out until that point. And so, well, that's part of like in leading youth group. That's kind of part of my goal, is to show people what that kind of small group can look like, I guess. Who knows how well I'm doing that, but trying.
Yeah.
So, do we have any more thoughts on this idea of mentoring and discipling, or do we have like a challenge or like a what to do from here? I mean, obviously we could just say go into all the world and make disciples, right? But how?
Well, for those of us who are not for those of us, for those that are older, should always be, I guess we should always be on the lookout for those who may have a need for mentorship.
Mm-hmm.
For those who are younger, should always be receptive to that idea and be seeking for that with humility. And I guess that's
I guess that's as much that can be said. So you either find a way that you can start mentoring, or maybe approach someone and ask them if you don't have a mentor, like if maybe I should go and approach someone and try to establish that relationship. Or get the ball rolling. Do we have any other thoughts?
That should about wrap this podcast up.
So today we talked about hell, God's judgment, and mentoring.
Yes.
All topics that flow seamlessly together without any need for a proper segue.
Okay. So, thanks for watching the 7th episode of the Salt of the Earth podcast. We'll see you next week.
And until then, be salty.